All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you to everyone for joining us for today's webinar, Options for Reducing Lead Emissions from Piston-Engine Aircraft. I'm Elaine Farrell with the Transportation Research Board. Attendees are automatically muted when they join the webinar, but you can ask questions by using your control panel, which should appear on the right-hand side of your screen. The questions you type in will not be visible to other attendees, but they are sent directly to TRB and the panel. Type in any questions you have about troubleshooting the software or audio, or questions about the presentation here. We encourage you to type in your questions at any time. After the presentation is complete, the moderator will read the questions that she has received aloud. We will try to get through as many questions as we can in the time allotted. After the webinar, you will also receive a follow-up email that contains a link to the recording of today's session and a link to the slides. And now I'll turn things over to today's panel. Amy Pritchett from Penn State will present the report findings. And sorry, Amy, I'm having trouble getting you connected. Just a minute.
Elaine, are you able to see my screen now?
Yes.
All right, so are we clear to go?
Yes.
Great. Thank you to everyone who is here today. As Elaine noted, I will be providing an overview, a summary of our consensus study report on options for reducing lead emissions from piston-engine aircraft. Once I have finished the overview, then we will open up for the questions and answers, as Elaine noted. When we do move to the question and answers, we have the panel shown here. Myself, Kim Kenville of the University of North Dakota, Bernard Robertson, retired from Daimler Chrysler Corporation, Jay Turner from Washington University, and Tom Menzies from the Transportation Research Board, our host here today. Let me start by reviewing what our committee was chartered to do and how we operated. Our charter was created in Section 177 of the FAA Reauthorization Act in 2018, where Congress called for the national academies to study aviation gasoline with an assessment of existing non-leaded fuel alternatives to the aviation gasoline used by piston-powered general aviation aircraft today, ambient lead concentrations at and around airports where piston-powered general aviation aircraft are used, and mitigation measures, calling out several mitigation measures as shown here, where these are examples, non-exclusive, of the mitigations that the committee examined. The committee is shown here. We are a diverse committee, volunteering, representing several different broad areas of expertise. They include those familiar with airport and aircraft operations, represented in our panel today by Kim Kenville, those familiar with aircraft fuels, fuel technologies and propulsion systems, represented here today by Bernard Robertson, and those particularly familiar with environmental concerns and health hazards, represented here by Jay Turner. The committee held multiple meetings of the full committee and of subgroups for information gathering and deliberation. These meetings included presentations from representatives of the FAA, EPA, state agencies, aircraft and engine manufacturers, airports, fixed-base operators who dispense aviation fuel, small airplane operators, suppliers and developers of aviation fuel, and the environmental research community. This was supplemented by a substantial amount of written information. And I'll note that all of the information received is in the public record. The report was then reviewed by two members of the National Academy of Engineering, or rather the report process was overseen by two members of the National Academy of Engineering based on reviews by the reviewers shown here, also representing a broad group of, a broad population, a broad range of expertise. So now, stepping into the findings and recommendations of our report. First, In Chapter 2 of our report, we outlined the findings we had as we researched general aviation, the background of what general aviation is, to help better understand the scope of the problem here. Let me start by outlining the functions provided by general aviation. Of course, it's common to think first of the recreation and personal transport function of general aviation, small aircraft owned by personal individuals. But we also recognize that there's many other functions that are provided by general aviation. These include transport and medical evacuation, or medevac, in remote areas, flight training, even if a pilot is planning to fly large jets for an airline, the general aviation aircraft are where their preliminary flight training is first required, serving as the bridge in training for the larger aircraft. Law enforcement, search and rescue, and firefighting are examples we show here of roles that are often undertaken by local law enforcement or other government agencies. Looking at piston-engine aircraft, and I'll note we're talking here at about 170,000 aircraft in the United States operating at this time. So we noted they can serve many different purposes, but two broad classifications for them. Those that are personally owned and therefore inferred to be used for personal and recreational flying comprise about 75% of the fleet. They're less heavily used, and so they represent about 50% of the flight hours flown. Those used for business, government, and commercial purposes, while only 25% of the fleet, are estimated to represent 50% of hours flown. And with that, they're estimated to consume more than half the avgas, as they tend to be the larger and higher performance airplanes that, flying half the hours, burn fuel at a faster rate. Of these 170,000 aircraft, the annual fleet turnover is very low, with an estimated 900 new aircraft added per year. With this, the average aircraft age of this class of aircraft is estimated to be 50 years. And the designs have stayed fairly constant, especially for the airframe and propulsion technologies. So, for example, the Cessna 172, shown in the lower right, first built in 1955, still in use, still in production, with very much the same type of airframe and basic engine technologies in place. Changing the aircraft has considerations not only with the simple purchase cost of the new components and installation costs, but also this notion of retrofitting these aircraft requires extensive and expensive testing and FAA certification, such that retrofit costs can be a significant component of the total value of the vehicle, in some cases possibly exceeding the cost of the vehicle. When looking at lead emissions, it's also important to look at the airports. Looking at the nation's 13,100 different airports, about 75% of the fleet is based at roughly 1/4, 3,300 airports. The larger airports, often publicly owned by some mechanism, which includes municipalities, counties, and states. And these larger airports, or busier airports, I should say, are in the National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems, or NIPIAS, and with that eligible to receive some degree of federal assistance. However, the other 25% of the fleet is based at the other 75% of the airports, or 9,800 airports, that are not under NIPIAS. Many of these are small and have limited capacity to add fueling infrastructure or to assess the lead impact of their airport layout. Another important distinction to make in the airports is how different they are. I've shown on the bottom Van Nuys Airport, which I believe by some measures is the busiest general aviation airport in the nation. And on the bottom right, an airport in grass, no tarmac, that happens to be near my house in a field on my drive in to work. They would have very different infrastructures and capabilities to do assessments, change their layout, change their fueling mechanisms. I'll also note that they often have very different proximity to people. An example here, I stole this picture from Marion Hoyer of the EPA's presentation to the committee because I recognized it. The blue square is the roof of a playground structure built at an airport that I used to live near to and used to take my children to when they were small, so that we could play on that black surfaced playground while we watched the airplane start up, warm up, and taxi away. Looking at lead emissions from piston-engine aircraft, some things that I learned that I had not really put together as an aerospace engineer before is first, lead persists. Often when we talk about other forms of emissions, there's organic emissions, there's assumptions they degrade, decompose, and so forth. But instead, lead persists in the environment, and once emitted, then it accumulates in the environment. Over the last decades, lead has accumulated in our environment from a number of sources. And in the past, civil piston-engine aircraft weren't the largest source. However, as the other large sources of emissions have mitigated or eliminated lead, now general aviation aircraft are the largest source of lead emissions. And this is in the context of lead having accumulated and knowing that there's no known safe levels of human lead exposure. Together then, the importance of reducing lead exposure is recognized by our report, and it motivates the development and implementation of measures to reduce or eliminate lead emissions and/or zones of high airborne lead concentration. We note too that lead exposure can occur through multiple routes. The one that is the most evident in many of our research studies to date and so forth is looking at airborne lead emissions impacting neighboring communities. But we also recognize that past emissions can be deposited to the soil and other surfaces, and also recognize that occupational lead exposure for airport workers also occurs. And this can be through multiple mechanisms: inhalation, ingestion, and dermal absorption. We can be looking at both from combusted and uncombusted fuel. So there's a number of methods by which the lead can create exposure. Further, compared to other sources of lead emissions, we recognize that there's some unique aspects of aviation emissions. For example, a much smaller particle size than automotive emissions. These pictures here were taken by Jack Griffith, one of our committee members. He has a Piper Cub. He put some tape on a strut in the exhaust flow from the Cub, and after a flight with his electron microscope took these pictures. What is relevant here is the small size of the lead dibromide particles that were found, being smaller and different than the automotive emissions historically were. Studies of understanding of the health impact of automotive emissions may not translate well here, leading us recognizing that there are open questions then about what the exact health impact would be. So with this then, the health impact is something that we recognize and that motivates the need for mitigations. Following our original charter, we studied a range of mitigations, and I'll call out two of them that cannot widely help in the committee's opinion. The first is that imposing restrictions on aircraft using avgas would not be a viable sole mitigation. Restricting general aviation aircraft that use avgas, especially the higher performance aircraft, would have far-reaching ramifications for critical functions that include transportation, particularly in remote regions that may have otherwise have limited transportation options, ramifications for medical transport, and pilot training, amongst the broad functions outlined at the beginning of this talk. Likewise, we looked at the use of motor gasoline, by which we inferred the gasoline broadly produced for automobiles. But we recognize that motor gasoline as currently constituted today is not a viable unleaded alternative. Decades ago, some aircraft were listed as being able to use what was commonly called MoGas or motor gasoline back when motor gasoline did not have ethanol. But with the addition of ethanol, we find that it cannot be used in the vast majority of aircraft. Ethanol can cause vapor lock, which itself can cause an engine to fail in flight, which is not a good thing for a pilot. And ethanol is corrosive to aircraft components. Yet without ethanol, automobile gasoline does not meet minimum octane requirements. From here, instead, we would like to talk about the mitigations and actions that we do recommend. And we recognize that there is no single known technical solution that the committee, based on the publicly available information that we could look at, felt no mitigation that we felt is certain to be available in the near term. Instead, we recommend a multi-pathway approach. We recognize that the ultimate development of a drop-in fuel, one that can be used in all current aircraft yet without lead, should be pursued and would be a good solution. And we will talk about each of these in more detail next. But also, we recommend examining parallel pathways, ultimate development of new propulsion technologies that do not require leaded fuels, and in the interim, some mitigation pathways focused on modifying airport operations and practices and on using existing fuels in aircraft to lower the amount of lead and to reduce its exposure to populations. This is a big, hard challenge, in that the implementation will require the participation of many across a very diverse industry, including private, corporate, and public entities. This includes pilots, airport managers and personnel, fuel suppliers, aircraft propulsion, and airframe manufacturers. So our first recommendation is that the FAA, recognizing and building upon what they have been doing so far, should further coordinate its efforts to reduce lead pollution and exposure at airports, coordinating with those of other federal agencies that have key responsibilities for protecting public health, safety, and the environment at airports. This includes their longstanding coordination with the EPA, but also includes other agencies such as OSHA that would be concerned with the occupational health impacts of lead. We further recommend that they collaborate with these agencies to explore the regulatory and programmatic means within their respective jurisdictions that they can each bring to bear and combine in a complementary manner to reduce lead emissions and exposures at airports. Another thing that we look at is at pilot and airport personnel practices. And indeed, these photos here are snaps taken by my phone the last time recently that I went out to fuel an aircraft at a nearby airport. I was curious, I hadn't really looked before. There's a lot of big signage up noting, of course, the compelling concern that aviation gasoline is flammable and that multiple safety checks are needed. But was there a mention of lead? It turns out, at least in this anecdotal case that reflects our broader experience, there's one sign you can see in the self-fueling pump here where it says contains lead, but that sign then is obscured once one opens the panel to start fueling. This I just use anecdotally to reflect the broad finding of the committee that there is scarce mention of lead health hazards in FAA-related materials for flight training, aircraft maintenance, and airport management, and guidelines for refueling to avoid spills and emissions. And so we recommend that the FAA should initiate an ongoing campaign for education, training, and awareness of avgas lead exposure that is targeted to GA pilots, aircraft technicians, and others who work at airports. We recommend they partner with prominent organizations within the general aviation community. The campaign should be multi-pronged by ensuring that information on lead risks and mitigation practices is prominent in relevant materials for pilots, airport management, and aircraft technicians. And where appropriate, the information should also be covered in the relevant certification and licensure examinations. Indeed, this information should be featured on FAA and GA organization websites and included in written materials distributed at GA industry conferences, trade shows, and fly-ins. In addition, looking at airports, we recognize that the FAA has not updated its run-up area planning guidance to reflect the results of air quality studies that suggest the desirability of moving airport run-up locations away from where human activities occur, both on airport and neighboring communities, and moving them away from high traffic locations, such as runway ends where lead is emitted from aircraft taking off. So again, based on my own experience here, I brought in a satellite view from Google Maps of a particular airport that is known for having a Burger King, a Fairfield Inn, an Izzy Steakhouse right next to the airport. And I overlaid on it the airport surface chart, pointing out that there is also a run-up area on the other side of the chain link fence from these businesses. So with this, our committee's recommendation is the FAA should update its guidance on the location of run-up areas to reflect the results of research since the latest interim guidance was issued in 2013. And this guidance should include the need to account for both the emissions of engine run-ups and takeoffs, recognizing that these emissions may combine, creating even denser hotspots when analyzing the geographic distribution of lead emissions at the airport. And indeed, the emissions here, we mentioned run-ups and takeoffs. It also includes places where the aircraft may idle while waiting for pre-departure clearance and so forth, looking at where the lead is getting distributed. And with this, the purpose of this guidance should be to support airports' decisions of whether to move run-up areas to reduce people's exposure to lead emissions, while also accounting for other concerns, including safety and aircraft noise. So these are the mitigations and recommendations looking at changing aircraft operations in airports. Next, we looked at existing specified fuels and fleets. We note that there's two other fuels that have ASTM certification that would apply to all or some of the fleet. Let me start with 100 very low lead. It has the same octane rating as the 100 low lead currently used, but its ASTM standard requires nearly 20% less maximum lead content. This fuel, if produced, could be used by all piston engine aircraft. And with this, the fleet-wide use of 100 very low lead could reduce total lead emissions by avgas by up to 20%. Another fuel that is also under consideration is something that can be used by an estimated 57% of the current fleet. It's unleaded 94, which is the only existing grade of unleaded avgas. It would require a second supply chain for fuel and a second fuel distribution system across the nation, including a second fuel dispensing systems at airports. Consequently, widespread availability of unleaded 94 is likely to be restricted to a portion of airports that have or can afford to add the required fueling facilities. Put together then, we recommend looking at these two fuels because of the interim reductions in lead emissions that could be created through the use of fuels alone, while solutions that are lead-free are developed. If all suitable aircraft use unleaded 94, lead emissions would be reduced by up to 30%. If the higher performance aircraft were also to use 100 very low lead, the combined reductions in lead emissions using unleaded 94 for the aircraft that can and 100 VLL for aircraft that need it, the total reductions could exceed 40%. And so with this, we have the recommendation that the FAA should research public policy options for motivating refiners to produce and airports to supply 100 very low lead, striving for rapid implementation at the federal and state levels and by Congress. And likewise, that the FAA should research public policy options to enable and encourage greater use of available unleaded avgas, or UL94. Possible options to help support its broader use include issuing a special airworthiness information bulletin and providing airports with incentives and means to supply this unleaded fuel, particularly airports available for FAA-administered financial aid, notably those under NIPIAS. Finally, a mechanism should be established for facilitating the increased availability of existing grades of unleaded avgas across the fleet. Congressional involvement would likely be needed, such as by providing incentives for pilots to use existing unleaded avgas and for more airports to add the required fuel storage and dispensing capacity. So with this then, we have recommendations at the FAA, and this recommendation noting that congressional involvement would likely be needed, promoting the use of current day unleaded aircraft that can be used by part of the fleet or very low lead fuel that can be used by all of the fleet. Next, we recognize the search for lead-free fuels that can be used by the entire fleet. For several years, the Piston Aviation Fuels Initiative, or PAFI, has sought the development of an unleaded fuel that can drop in seamlessly into the fuel dispensing and supply chain that can be used by all aircraft. It has not yet yielded a viable replacement, but we recognize that it has led to the development of a fuel testing and evaluation process. It's prompted supplier interest in developing replacement fuels and sought solutions to many challenges associated with supplying an unleaded replacement fuel. And these are all valuable, indeed necessary steps towards the development of a drop-in unleaded fuel. So with this, we recommend the FAA should continue to collaborate with the GA industry, aircraft users and airports, and fuel suppliers in the search for and deployment of an acceptable and universally usable unleaded replacement fuel. The collaboration should be carried out through PAFI or an alternate similar holistic process, and should be carried out by making available the needed testing facilities that are needed to support FAA approvals. Further, this recommendation looks at changing the fuel. We also looked at lead-free propulsion systems. Now, we recognize that small aircraft pose unique engineering challenges. The propulsion systems have to be small, lightweight, and reliable enough that they are not going to leave the pilot without power mid-flight. So it's different mechanisms that come up when looking at these, including attempting to miniaturize systems used by larger aircraft, such as diesel, turboprop, and turbogenerator, or looking to the new electric and alternate fuel engines that are currently being experimented with. In doing so, we note that these technologies, whether we are miniaturizing bigger systems or looking to new systems, these technologies are currently not certified for broad use. They are generally listed as experimental. And as such, the remaining challenge in front of them, the certification and retrofit costs, can be prohibitive. With this, the committee recognizes that incentives are needed to develop new technologies to expand the use of currently available unleaded fuels in terms of new propulsion systems that can use them. And we recognize that the slow turnover rate of the GA fleet would limit the transition to new technologies, at least without new incentives for the retrofits and changes that be required. Therefore, we have several recommendations. The first shown here, that a clear goal should be established that all newly certified, as in the certifications to come, gasoline-powered aircraft after a certain point in time be approved to operate with at least one ASTM-approved unleaded fuel. And an additional amount of time should be identified by which all newly produced gasoline-powered aircraft, including those being built based on older type certificates, would attain that same goal. We recognize that this would probably require congressional action to establish the goal and timeframes. Likewise, further incentives would be needed to develop these new engine technologies, and the slow turnover rate of the GA fleet would limit the transition to new technologies without new incentives. Taken together, this creates a long timeline. To get this solution brought to bear, we need to start now. The FAA initiatives, so our recommendation is that FAA initiatives should be used to promote the development, testing, and certification of safe and environmentally desirable lead-free emerging propulsion systems, including diesel, electric, and jet fuel turbine engines for use in GA aircraft, including the requisite airport refueling and recharging infrastructure. We see this involving collaborations with industry and other government agencies, such as the Aeronautics Research at NASA, and congressional encouragement and provision of resources may be required. To put this into scope as to timeline, I show here a chart that Bob Mitchell prepared for our deliberations, looking at the notional timeline. If we started here today in 2021, when would we have a typical four-seat GA aircraft if we use the different propulsion systems? Going left to right along the horizontal axis, we're looking at the timeline, and looking vertically, we're looking at the endurance of the aircraft in terms of flight endurance in hours, which also directly scales to the range of the airplane. The current day piston engine aircraft highlights the efficiency that is achieved with current day systems. In comparison with other systems, we see that we either have very low relative energy density, such as the pure electric using today's battery technology, resulting in an aircraft that, between the weight of the batteries and the new systems, would have a very limited endurance and range. Better endurance and range with other systems such as turboprop and diesel and turbo generator, but again, recognizing that these are more experimental. And the hoped for idealized vision of what might be possible with pure electric future battery technology. Right, putting this together, I know I've listed a number of recommendations spanning a range of mitigations, and now this chart here is an attempt to put them together. We've already talked about each of the mitigations shown in each of the columns here, but the overall picture I'd like to present here is one that this is, as we called it, a multi-pathway approach. On the left, the airport operations and practices can have a very near-term time frame for starting to reduce lead emissions and exposure to what lead emissions remain. Looking at existing fuels and fleet, moving to 100 very low lead and unleaded 94, would look to focus of implementation on the fuel supply chain and possibly require a range of policy and incentives. And then the longest term, where we would be looking at lead-free technologies, is looking at making it so that we could use unleaded fuels, such as unleaded 94 in all new aircraft, or a new fuel, 100 unleaded, that does not currently exist in all aircraft, and new propulsion systems. It's only on the right that we would get to the 100% elimination of lead if fully implemented. But again, we are generally moving from near term to midterm to farther term as we progress across this summary from left to right. Finally, our committee recognized as well that there's places where further study, understanding, and information would help inform these mitigations. One is mitigations at specific airports here, looking at our ability to model and predict the airborne lead concentrations around airports. We looked at the ability to better assess the feasibility and effectiveness of airport-specific mitigations. This would benefit from an improved understanding of how these are reflected by individual airport characteristics. And so we recommend the EPA should conduct more targeted monitoring and enhance computational modeling of airborne lead concentrations at airports of potential concern, as indicated by a recent screening study, to evaluate aircraft operations that are main contributors to lead hotspots, and to design airport-specific mitigation measures. Also, as noted before with the electron microscope photographs made by Jack Griffith on our committee, lead and piston engine aircraft exhaust occurs in particles smaller than that observed in automobile exhaust. and therefore we recommend the EPA and NIEHS should sponsor research to improve the understanding of the physical state of lead-containing particles, to inform future studies of atmospheric transport and deposition, human exposure, and health risks of lead emissions from GA aircraft. And this would include emissions from various types of GA aircraft and would need to also account for the impact of using a different lower lead content, such as that found in 100 very low lead. And then finally, looking at the routes of lead exposure. We have focused on airborne emissions. We recognize its value. We also note that past emissions from piston-engine aircraft that have been deposited to soil and other surfaces can contribute to present-day lead exposures at locations within and near airports. And so we recommend the EPA and NIEHS should sponsor research to enhance the understanding of lead exposure routes and their relative importance for people living near airports and working at them. In closing, a key message here is that we could not find one single mitigation that we had confidence and certainty would, in the near term, eliminate lead. So instead, we recommend a multi-pronged approach. Near and midterm mitigations can reduce lead emissions and exposure, and other longer-term technical developments have the potential for much larger impacts. And with this, we'll move to the questions. Thank you for your time. As Elaine noted in the briefing at the start, feel free to type your questions into the system. And I invite our panelists, I see they're also bringing up their video. Now, Elaine, I'm worried I've got my screen configured in some way. I've pressed on the little triangle by questions, but the question, it's like the questions themselves are smudged in so small that I can't see them.
Yes, you do have to expand your questions box.
Oh, great.
There's a little square there with an arrow.
Okay, all right. My apologies. You would think that I hadn't practiced this beforehand. All right, excuse me for one moment, just while I catch up now that I can see the questions here. Okay. The first question is fairly long. I hope I can just summarize it here. It is asking whether the panel considered the market ramifications of fielding multiple unleaded low-octane fuels while expecting fuel providers to continue development of an unleaded high-octane aviation fuel replacement. The concern is that multiple fuels dilute the market share for the high-octane fuels such that investments to continue in development of an unleaded solution would not be economically justifiable because of the high development costs. Yes, we did consider that. And indeed, in the recommendations, I'll note that the recommendations included looking to the FAA and in some places Congress to recognize the policy and other incentive mechanisms that would be required for a broad-based industry to be able to implement this. And Bernard, I know you also studied this in more detail. Anything that you would like to add?
Well, not really. There is, as you said, there's a great deal in the report about the problems of a bifurcated distribution and dispensing system, the recognition that there are significant economic obstacles to that. Nevertheless, of course, there is UL 94 is out there, albeit at 100 airports or maybe less. it is possible, but there is a big economic barrier. And as you mentioned, we've suggested some ways to try to address that.
Thank you. And indeed, Bernard, stay on. I see the next three questions here. Indeed, I'll just point the next one to you, reading it out loud. Engines such as Rotex 912 and the modern LS are quite happy with today's MOGAS. So why simply ignore this growing sector?
Well, I don't think we ignore it. We do point out in Chapter 6 that there are a number of engines out there that are certificated on lower octane fuels, which is promising. Pretty much all the Rotax engines. We mentioned the Continental TSIO 550K, which is certified on UL 94. So the good news is that it is technically possible. And going forward, the point we make citing those examples is that going forward, the potential we think exists to gradually build more new production engines that are satisfied with UL 94, for example. The big problem is, as you pointed out, is the 170,000 legacy fleet, and what do you do with those?
Thank you. And the next question too, it was found in the study, it was found that the amount of leaded avgas use has declined steadily for the last 6 years. Again, Werner, I know you looked at this in more detail.
Well, it has declined steadily. I'm not sure, was there a specific question embedded in that?
Yeah.
Numbers, I think. In the report, we've got the overall trend, I think, over the last 20 years, and it's declining, as I recall, off the top of my head, 0.6% every year. But of course, so it's sort of self-correcting, but it'll take decades and decades at that rate to solve the whole problem. I may have missed the embedded question in there, but yes, we did recognize that it is a shrinking market. That does, of course, increase the economic challenge of if we were to bifurcate the market into different types of fuel.
Great. And we are also asked, did the committee examine the lead content of existing commercially available fuels to examine to what degree FBO aviation gasoline already meets the 100 very low lead specification? I'll note here too that in the estimates we provided of fuel of lead reduction in moving from 100 low lead to 100 very low lead, we were basing it using the same mechanism the EPA would use on their predicted or worst case lead, which is based on the maximum amount of lead in this. Talking with the fuel refiners, we recognize that often the maximum lead in it, that the lead can vary between a minimum and maximum, but that the impact of very low lead is that it would reduce the maximum amount of lead allowable.
If I could add, Amy, I'm glad that question was asked, because we do know that a significant fraction of the 100 low lead currently sold actually meets the VLL specs, which is good news because it says that yes, it's possible to make it, and also it's entirely fungible with low lead, so there's no need to separate out VLL from LL, other than perhaps for marketing reasons. As far as the content, the average lead content in low lead, the last time EIA reported it, was 0.47 grams per liter, which is just above the maximum for VLL. So we know that some fraction of the LL complies with VLL, but we also know the mean is above, the mean of LL is above the max of VLL. So if you tighten the distribution of lead in low lead such that it meets the maximum permitted by VLL, you lower the mean by 19.6%. So that's the basis for us saying that the reduction, if it were all made as VLL, should approach 20%.
Thank you. We had another question on bifurcating the fuel supply chain that I believe was answered in a similar question first. So moving on, I will note there are several questions here that I will touch on, reflecting the fact that our committee was not empowered to make policy, nor were we in a position to do detailed analysis of the economic and policy systems. So, for example, one question is, industry seems to be concerned in getting involved in PAFI because they want to protect their IP investment. Is this a valid concern? I'm afraid that this is up to them. That was not our place to be making policy for the fuel manufacturers about their IP concerns. In our findings and recommendations on developing a drop-in fuel, we note the value of having both mechanisms for open transfer where appropriate and for having a common testing standard for the fuel. A question as to unleaded Swift 100R is being available for years and it's a drop-in. Why hasn't the FAA certified this fuel? I'm sorry, we are not qualified to answer that. Then a question asking, noting that we mentioned that regulating the use of avgas was not viable due to the economic impact. I'll be careful here. Our finding and recommendation here said that limiting the use of aircraft that need to burn unleaded fuel would impact critical functions and is not by itself the sole possible capability. So, throughout, we recognize that the recommendations call on the FAA and in some places Congress to look at the various policy, regulatory, and other incentive mechanisms for helping refiners and companies develop appropriate fuels to reduce lead impact. Another question here is, it now moves more to emissions. The current EPA NEI does not accurately represent the amount of lead released at individual airports, as it only includes lead emissions from the landing and takeoff cycle. Ground run-up emissions are not factored in, nor are the overflight lead emissions generated by circling by flight training. Does the committee have any thoughts on how the EPA can provide more accurate information about the total amount of lead released by general aviation? Jay, are you up for this one?
Yeah, there are certainly certain assumptions that go into estimating the lead emissions at a specific airport, in large part because general aviation airports do not have very detailed activity data collected. And in this case, in terms of obtaining more accurate estimates of what the lead emissions might be, I refer you to certain ACRP, Airport Cooperative Research Program reports that lay out methodologies for how to estimate those emissions, if indeed you're able to collect on-site activity data.
Thank you. And indeed, that was one of our ending recommendations, where more science and understanding, more data would help address the mitigations. So, another question, if we recognize that lead exposure is near airports, why are we not warning the people who live around those airports? Again, I will look to the appropriate federal agencies for whom this is within their charter, as something that we hope this report helps inform and call out where there is a need for policy. Again, it's not the charter of this committee to be doing that. Do we know what other countries are doing on this? No, but we know that the USA has a fairly unique role in general aviation, both in the production of the engines that burn the leaded fuel and in having remote regions that depend on them. What is the committee's role after today? I think at this point, our charter is done. Give us another half an hour. I'm sorry, I shouldn't look lethal. It has been educational, informative, and I hope that our findings here are helpful to everyone. But our charter is done here. Of course, we are open for follow-on. I've been talking to some reporters, for example. So we are happy to share the results of the report and help explain them anywhere that is out there. There is a question from Colin Williamson that looks like it was cut off. So Colin, if you didn't type it in again, please do, because I can't make it out. Yes, here's a question. Can different types of fuel, example, unleaded 94 and 100 low lead, be mixed in a given aircraft? Bernard, again, this is a tricky question because the answer is yes in some cases and no in others. So may I hand it off to you?
Well, that's true. There are some aircraft, engines and aircraft that are certificated to burn either. Typically, I think the Rotax engines and the aircraft that use them are certified that way. I mentioned the Continental TSIO 550K, which is certificated in a Cirrus. That aircraft is certificated on 100 low lead and UL 94. So it's legal if the aircraft is certificated for it. It's not legal if it's not, I think, is the short answer.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. And I see Colin did type in his question right after this here. What is the basis for estimating a 30% reduction in lead emissions if capable aircraft use 94 UL? And later, a related question, for example, in Sweden, 95% of piston-engine aircraft now use 94 UL. So the 30% reduction, I believe that mirrors our estimate of the fuel burned by the airplanes in the US fleet that are capable of burning UL 94. Comparisons to other countries, I'm sorry, I do not know Sweden. I am only inferring that we have a very different aircraft composition than their fleets that tend to involve higher performance, high compression engines that cannot burn UL 94. By having a different fleet, we get a different reduction. Bernard, did I do that okay?
Well, could I just elaborate on one thing? In the report, we estimate that somewhere between 57% and I think 68% of the legacy fleet could burn UL 94, but it's also estimated that roughly 30% of the fleet burn 70% of the fuel. If I got that right. So the 30% estimate is based on how much fuel those that are capable of burning UL 94 would actually use. Did I get that right?
I think so.
Yeah. And the uncertainty, again, the report covers this in more detail. The FAA study, a very, very extensive FAA study, calculated 57% of the legacy fleet could use UL 94, and the other 43% would need, for example, 100 octane. Other people have estimated a higher number because some of those aircraft that the FAA considered that required 100 low lead were actually certificated when 100 low lead was the only fuel available, so they were naturally certificated on that, but could probably use UL 94. So you see a number from 57 to 68% estimated that could use UL 94, but they don't use that fraction of the avgas. That's why the potential percentage reduction is estimated to be 30%. And that, of course, presupposes that the UL 94 is available widely to be used, which is not currently the case.
Thank you. Another question, could land use measures be considered as part of mitigations? For example, in the airport example with food places and hotels near the run-up areas, local land use may need review to help increase separation of airport sources and impact areas. Yes. Yes, it could. And it would be informed by having better data about how to model what are the lead levels, the emissions, how are the emissions distributed, and how broadly do they get distributed. And with that, we would be looking at not just the airport itself, but it has potential for local land use and questions of how closely populations can be next to the airport in such dense situations. You noted that avgas particulate emissions have a smaller particle size than automotive. This seems counterintuitive and different than other data we've seen. Can you please shed some light on the reason or mechanisms why avgas emissions engines would emit smaller particle sizes? Bernard?
As far as I was aware, I wasn't really part of that study. Of course, that's really Jack's specialty. But as far as I recall, the analysis that he did on aircraft particle size had never been done before. If it's been done elsewhere, if there are other studies, I'm certainly not aware of it. I don't think Jack was. But his hypothesis, without testing it, was that typically the aircraft exhaust the exhaust system on an aircraft is typically very short. It's maybe 18 inches, 24 inches at most, and you dump the exhaust into the atmosphere. So the quenching phenomenon on the exhaust is completely different from a passenger car where you may have 10, 12, 15 feet of exhaust before it reaches the atmosphere. That was his hypothesis, but again, without specifically testing it.
Great.
And if I may just elaborate on that, Amy. So Bernard's explanation, I think, is a solid one. And if there are other studies on the emissions particle size distribution for piston engine aircraft, that would be great to know. There's extensive data on this for jets, but not so much for piston engine aircraft. And Bernard's correct. You have the longer residence time, if you will, or lifetime in the exhaust system that allows the particles to get bigger. Plus the aircraft, once it exits the exhaust, there's a much higher dilution rate with the surrounding air than there is with an automobile. And that faster dilution rate freezes out the particle sizes, preventing them from continuing to grow by sticking together.
Right. Thank you. And Jay, I'm glad that your microphone's on because we're ready for you. We have a range of questions here looking at the health impact of lead. I will pick one of them and we'll then follow up with other questions if you don't happen to also touch on the other questions. So I'll start with, what do health impact studies demonstrate regarding how harmful lead emissions near airports, how harmful are they to the general population? And do the studies show specifically relate to mortality and morbidity?
The studies that have currently been conducted are focused more on what are the blood lead levels near general aviation airports, and are they elevated compared to people living at so-called background locations farther away from airports. That's different from studies where you actually try and assign an actual health effect. In this case, using blood lead levels as a surrogate for levels of concern, where high lead levels could over time trigger different types of health effects. So now blood lead levels are used as the proxy or surrogate for exposures, and it would be separate work that to my knowledge has not been done. Perhaps there's a study, but I'm not aware of it, that has actually looked at the actual mortality and morbidity that would arise from exposures near airports.
Thank you. And what are we talked in the overview here about the different paths for lead exposure to humans, apart from immediate combustion. They put it as, that is, how is persistent lead taken up by humans?
Yeah, so there's different ways that that could happen. Even though we're thinking here about lead emissions and direct inhalation, a major source of lead exposure is actually lead emissions to the air that deposit onto the ground. And then you have hand-to-mouth uptake of dirt, such as by children, but really anyone. And so that's a major source of lead exposure, previously deposited airborne lead. Similarly, you could have lead that deposits onto food, and if it's not washed thoroughly, for example, that's another route of lead. So these are just other examples of exposure routes.
Great, thank you. Indeed, there's a couple questions here looking at monitoring air quality. Are there air quality monitors near GA airports that could perhaps flag exceedances of the NAAQS? Is there a way for airports to identify their hotspots or otherwise quantify how much lead emissions might be dispersed both on and off airports? If you could, the flavor there being, are there monitors? Do we have monitors at airports recording this?
Yes, there are. The EPA had a program that asked the states to conduct monitoring at a number of airports for which the emission inventory suggested that or estimated that the emissions were above a certain threshold level per year. And they were required to put in monitors and run them for a year at least, perhaps longer in some cases, to assess the concentrations that are observed. Those are actually very tricky studies in terms of where you actually site the monitor, in terms of is it on public space or not, because we're concerned about exposures in public space from an EPA perspective. We're concerned about that. But that data is available on the EPA website. You can actually see reports that summarize what the lead concentrations were at various airports from these studies.
Thank you. And indeed, when you say they were monitored at some airports, roughly how many, do you recall?
Dozens, but certainly, I recall it's certainly less than 50, but it was dozens.
Yes, yeah, I just want to put that in the context relative to 13,100 airports nationwide. In other words, it's not like every airport has multiple monitors and can be assessing the lead distribution around the airport. Instead, it's more at the point of assessing at potential flagged airports, the potential, what might be happening. It's still at a early introductory.
From the EPA perspective, it is necessarily at this point in time focused on potential violations of the air quality standard and citing monitors to detect whether or not that is occurring.
All right, thank you. Another question that I will only briefly touch on: can Congress develop legislation limiting the use of avgas prior to a leaded fuel endangerment finding by the EPA? Okay, I am not a lawyer. This is not our charter. In the report, we noted that there are multiple policy routes, not just for Congress, which it can do an awful lot, but also for the EPA. And so the recommendations included that the FAA, EPA, and other relevant federal agencies look at what is available to them within their jurisdiction. So this is not limited to an EPA endangerment finding. Another question, Bernard, was a question that some producers may have trouble producing 100 VLL to the ASTM specifications. Is this case? What's the challenge facing the refiners and the difficulty in refining this fuel?
Well, we certainly recognize that to produce the fuel to a tighter specification is not necessarily a simple task. It's not just a matter of saying do it and it can be done. We don't claim expertise in refining technology, and that's why we recommend that the FAA work with the refiners to determine just what does it take. It clearly it is possible to manufacture it, as we discussed earlier, and we recognize that if it can be done, if just simply the amount of VLL out there is increased, the more of it that gets used, the less lead we use. So it's highly desirable to do it, but we don't know technologically just how challenging it would be to make all of the fuel that way. And it could possibly impact the smaller refiners more than the large ones, perhaps, which we mention in the report. And again, that's why we're not suggesting categorically just do it. We're recommending that it be studied to determine how technologically feasible it is and what the economic impacts would be and whether it would require incentives to do it.
Thank you. And just to confirm, someone asked to confirm that VLL and LL, 100 VLL and 100 LL can be mixed.
Yes,
So
yes. In effect, they are today. I mean, there is no VLL being sold as such, but there's a fair amount of VLL out there. It's just simply commingled with LL, which, as I mentioned, is good news because it's certainly fungible and could be used quite safely by all aircraft out there.
Great. Thank you. We have some questions asking why the report did not recommend that people who live near airports be warned about the use of leaded avgas. Again, we have called out what we see, we have summarized, reviewed, and captured the health impacts of lead as relevant here, and have pointed these out to the relevant federal agencies whose charter it would be. This report is publicly available, but we are not in a position to be targeting the distribution of this report. It is out there, it is available for everyone, and we hope that it is read by all the appropriate people who can be making the appropriate changes. So another question, Kim, are you ready? Yes. It was brought out in the study. Was it brought out in the study what flying in full rich means and how flight schools commonly ask their students to do this when flying around at low levels, which gives the maximum amount of lead emission?
I don't know that we talked about what full rich is. I think it's an assumption when you're flying full mixture rich. When we talk to the flight school that I work at, for instance, we're teaching safety, we're teaching checklist adherence, and trying to make sure we have the safest atmosphere possible. And so we didn't, get into the different flight schools and their procedures. And their procedures are usually approved by the FAA and the Flight Standard District Office in their curriculum. So we didn't really get into anyone's curriculum per se.
And indeed, we did note that the awareness and the operations could include helping operators, aircraft operators, which would include flight schools and pilots, to question when and how they do run-ups and other operations of their vehicle, balancing safety with the emissions. For example, a run-up is done where the airplane is brought up to a reasonably high power, sometimes full power, at some point on the ground before takeoff to make certain your engine is working before you take off. That's motivated by safety. But helping pilots recognize that they may not need a full large run-up before a flight where they haven't even turned off the engine from the previous flight. They landed and taxied back, for example. Also recognizing that run-ups or other engine settings may not need to be for an entire duration, that you don't need to be running the engine up high for a very long time while on the ground to check the safety, and that some education could help pilots maintain safety without unwittingly running the aircraft in configurations for long periods or at unusual settings that would increase emissions. And oh, Gary, thank you for mentioning. He mentions the monitoring was at 17 airports, Jay. Thank you. Thank you, Gary, for putting that in. In the recommendations regarding the development of new drop-in fuels, do you include recommendations regarding the potential risks of adverse effects from alternative fuels? We note that the FAA, we were focused on lead here, and we note that the FAA in finding an alternative drop-in fuel would have to make certain it's safe. That includes safe for the pilots and aircraft occupants in terms of being a reliable fuel, as well as assessing any other issues that may come up with the fuel. Beyond that, we did not look at any other specific aspects of alternative fuels. So another question, the EU allows aircraft to use UL94 if the engine is certified to use it, even if the aircraft certification doesn't specify UL94. Will the FAA adopt this? Again, I'm sorry, I do not mean to be glib, that is the FAA's choice. We do know in our recommendation on UL94 that we recommended a, Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin be issued, which is one of several possible mechanisms by which the FAA could look at questions of the certification and approval. Did I say that correctly, Bernard? I want to be very careful.
Yes, that's correct. I also note related to that that I believe it's true to say that the airframe manufacturers' rules are predominant. In other words, an engine may be certified on several different fuels, perhaps, but the airframer determines the fuel to be used in the aircraft, and their type certificate data sheet specifies that.
Okay. Great. And wow, so many questions. I'm parsing down, just want to make certain we call out any that haven't been touched on yet. And indeed, for everyone who's providing us some points of information about aircraft piston engine particle emissions measured in Switzerland, for example, we thank you for that, and I'm sure we will be capturing these. Okay. Another thing about the emission sources that was touched in the previous question, Jay, was what are the different paths for emission? And while they talked about the persistent lead, is there anything also about the occupational hazard of working with a leaded fuel even before combustion, such as the mechanics?
Yeah, certainly. Indeed, most of the focus of our work was on the exhaust emissions from the aircraft. But in Chapter 3, in the latter portions of Chapter 3, there is discussion about occupational exposures. And these are not just the lead particles, but actual vaporization of the leaded fuel itself. Tetraethyl lead is a rather volatile compound, and thus there can be vapor lead exposures in addition to the particle exhaust exposures.
Thank you. Indeed, I thought of this. I was in a maintenance hangar this past week, and the guy cleaned the oil off the cowling with a spray bottle. I asked what it was, and he said 100 low lead. It works great for cleaning airplanes. So it's interesting just to look at the degree to which there's not a broad awareness of the hazards of using it amongst the occupational community that interacts with it. Good. Another comment down at the bottom, the use of motor gasoline has more concern beyond the use of ethanol. The wide range of volatility, particularly in the winter, could give some GA aircraft some problems as well. Not stated as a question, but Bernard, could you elaborate a bit on this? We learned a fair amount from the refiners about motor gasoline and how different it is in terms of its production, the consistency of the recipe, and so forth.
Yeah, that's what the questioner said was perfectly true. One of the concerns among many that we had about motor gasoline is, as you said, it essentially all has ethanol in it now. And if you intercept the delivery system to get the fuel before the ethanol is added, it's fuel that's being formulated in anticipation of ethanol being added to it. And so that product has indeterminate vapor pressure and octane level and other characteristics. It doesn't well, it basically can't be assumed to comply with any ASTM specification until the ethanol is added to it. So yes, the questioner is quite correct. We did have some discussion about the 62,000 or so STCs that are out there for motor gasoline, and there are a number of questions are being asked about, well, what about those aircraft? And our charter was to look at ways to reduce the amount of lead that's used, and not to necessarily retroactively go back and try to disenfranchise people that bought an STC 40 years ago. If they're able to operate safely on that fuel, we've no compelling desire to, as I say, disenfranchise them. But going forward, MoGas just simply doesn't lend itself as an opportunity to further reduce the amount of lead by expanding its usage. That was where the committee came out.
I see there's several questions asking about the health impact. Some asking whether the assumption that there's no safe blood level has it been proven. Some asking more about whether how blood level relates to morbidity and mortality or other more profound markers of health. And with that as a background, Jay, can you look at the question that asks, would it make sense to study the health histories and aspects of those individuals directly involved in the GA industry for decades to see if there's any foundation for a broader public concern?
The question of occupational exposures versus community exposures is an interesting one. And we have to be careful here that sometimes studies of occupational exposures can inform us about community exposures, which are going to most likely be at lower concentrations, a different part of the so-called dose response curve. But we have to be careful that in scenarios like this, the occupational exposures might be different in nature than the community exposures. As we just talked about, in the case of the occupational exposures, there might be vapor lead emissions in addition to the particle lead emissions. And in the community exposures, those vapor lead emissions are probably going to be extremely small, if not completely negligible. So we have to be careful in taking occupational exposures and extrapolating them to the community.
Okay, and in a broader sense, if I reworded the question just a little bit, would it make sense to say the health histories and aspects of those individuals directly touched by general aviation? So let's look at that in a community sense of people neighboring the airports as well as the occupational people, the occupational exposure from people working with the airplanes. Can you just quickly summarize for us some of the studies that have looked at people who are impacted by general aviation using lead, health impacts?
Yes. So again, we want to make a distinction here between studies that couple together lead exposure to general aviation activities from studies that actually look at health effects of lead. And as we mentioned earlier, when we come to lead exposure, what we're typically focused on is blood lead levels, because there are so many studies that use blood lead level as a proxy for lead levels and other organs that cause effects, like neurological disorders and things like that, neurodysfunction. So there are studies such as one by our committee member, a very well-known study by Marie-Lynn Miranda, which looked at a series of airports and the blood lead levels of people living at varying distances from the airport over the first several hundred meters up to a kilometer or so, and saw a gradient indeed of decreasing blood lead levels as you went away from the airport. So there are studies such as this that do directly link proximity to airports to elevated blood lead levels.
And the
With
proximity
regard to the
they talk about, just one point of fact, the proximities they talk about, if I recall right, is what, 500 meters within an airport, 1,000 meters proximity to an airport, on the order of that, if I remember correctly? Yeah.
That's correct. Those are precisely the numbers that they looked at. And at 500, they saw higher levels And at 1,000, they saw lower levels, but still noticeable compared to background. Then with regard to the health effects of lead, the literature on this is vast. And for those who are interested, especially in a rather digestible format, EPA's Integrated Science Assessment, from the most recent review of the EPA Air Quality Standard for Lead, is a very comprehensive document, but also written in a very palatable way to understand what the health effects of lead exposures are.
Thank you. Good. Indeed, Jay, your response, I appreciate it because I think it touched on several questions about health and emissions and how they're related and what we do know. Why the committee's recommendation was that there's no acceptable blood level for lead, and with that, the fact that there are, albeit just a couple so far, but so far they are providing consistent evidence that emissions do track out to communities on the scale of 500 and 1,000 meters. Great. Good. I think the many of the questions are starting to wind down, but looking at what's come in the last few minutes, it's now getting into a discussion between some familiar names about autogas STCs being used as the certification basis for using 94U lead. I'm not certain there's a question there. Bernard, is there something that they raised that we should comment on?
Let me try to find the question.
They're at the bottom too, came in at 216 and 217.
Oops. Still trying to find them. Bear with me. Probably need to expand this.
I think that was
Amy?
my problem at the start. Yes,
Could I just make one comment?
absolutely, please.
I think on the education front, I think those of us that have been in the business a long time understand the difference between leaded and unleaded. And I was talking to a group of students, college students, and they actually asked me what leaded fuel meant and what unleaded fuel meant. So you have to remember that, the group coming up behind us hasn't been embroiled in this as long and doesn't really understand. So the education piece, I think, is very important because they actually may not understand touching this fuel or getting this fuel on their hands and skin is actually, not something to have happen, and making sure that you wash your hands right away. So, the education piece is really important. We forget this younger generation was born into a society where they largely have never seen leaded gas. And even though they see the word avgas, it might not mean the same thing, or they might not understand it quite fully.
I did look at those two questions about STCs and MOGAS. One was just really a comment that an aircraft that's STC'd for MOGAS can certainly use UL94, and absolutely that's true.
Yes. And then Jay, another question just came in at 2:23. The Miranda study did not involve broader impacts, such as flight training schools, which involve pilots circling for hours on end over homes, neighborhood schools, waterways, and prime farmland, close in and at a distance from the airport. Are there studies underway to measure the broader impact?
Yeah, so the Miranda study, in a way, did study that in the sense that it was looking at blood lead levels and not actual lead airborne lead concentrations. So what you would be measuring in the blood would be the cumulative effects of all of those types of activities. Now, what they didn't try to do, and I think understandably, is they didn't try to apportion back different levels of blood lead to different types of activities. That really would not been within the scope of their work, nor feasible for that type of a study, frankly. So we do have this separate question then of the work that's needed to understand how the different types of activities are coupled to emissions, which then are coupled to concentrations that people are exposed to. As you just mentioned, the notion of these ideas of so-called hotspots near downwind of run-up areas versus the perhaps lower level but consistent background type of elevated lead you might have from aircraft circling at low altitudes aloft. That's going to be just very different types of sources of exposure that really require a combination of modeling and measurements to sort out.
And I am not in this field. I just remember reading the Miranda studies, the difficulty in defining what the background is.
It's actually quite challenging.
Yeah. And so picking a benchmark population to compare against, you have to look at past pollutants that may have already influenced blood level in the population beforehand and so forth. So these are tricky studies to do.
Very much so.
Again, we keep pointing to a few number of studies. They sign that our recommendations to continue studying this so that we better understand the scope and magnitude of the problem and can better direct the mitigations is also important. So I note that some of the later comments, Miranda only looked at 66 airports with very few flight schools. Yes, there's so much more that can be looked at. Another question, recommended signage for installation at airport fueling stations. As the chair, I'll just take that one because it's not in our scope to actually write the signage. But we do hope that our recommendation to work on awareness will help, is something that the FAA, we noted it as being in their training, their broad awareness, even licensure and certification. And we hope that that would map to broad practices and the signage that would support it. We also note in the report that this awareness will also be valuable as a direct effect in helping change practices that unwittingly increase lead exposure to the airport community and neighboring communities, but also that this awareness will be a valuable thing for helping the community understand in a broader sense the extent to which lead is emitted by general aviation and help support changes that may be required beyond just their personal operations in the future. Okay. And I think we just have a couple minutes left, so we recommend, oh, have you considered biomass as a monitor? Okay, Jay, Mr. Mongolia, have you ever heard of that? I have no idea.
Yeah, actually, it's a great point. So there are studies that have been done where you use things like moss to detect heavy metal deposits. This is very popular, for example, in parts of Canada, where you use heavy metal accumulation like lead in moss to understand the spatial and temporal patterns of lead deposition. So yes, it's something that you could do if you're doing long-term monitoring.
Of course, to what degree can we isolate whether lead came from aviation versus other sources? If you went out and there's a bunch of lead, how would you separate whether that came from a heavy industry upwind versus the aircraft that are practicing their flight training maneuvers overhead?
So for that, I refer you to one figure in the ACRP report 0234, some work that came out of our group, where you can look at something called isotopes of lead, okay? And it turns out that all of the lead currently being used in avgas comes from a very narrow set of mines in Australia. And it has a very distinct isotopic characteristic, a fingerprint, if you will, of the forms of lead that are in it. And compared to, say, US soil, it's very distinct. And so we actually did those measurements and mapped it out, and could show that when you're near the hotspots, that's when you really had the composition that looked like lead, and when you were far away, it looked more like native soil.
All right, thank you. Great, and thank you to everyone who's joined in. provided questions, and in some cases has been providing data points for us as well. I'm grateful to everyone. I think that we are at time. I showed an end time of 2:30 here for this. So I would just like to wrap it up and thank everyone for joining in. I'd especially like to thank the committee and the representatives of the different parts of our committee here who have joined me on the screen as panelists. Again, it's so diverse. I had never met Jay before. Jay, I don't know if we ever would have crossed paths, a stinking aerospace engineer and a health hazard and emissions expert. And so we had to spend a lot of time really balancing a wide range of operational, human health, and technological factors. And I especially want to publicly thank the committee for their help here. I'd also like to thank the TRB staff, who in the end did so much of the legwork. Tom Menzies, who's on, and Ray Wassel, especially as our study director. So thank you, everyone.
I'd also like to extend my thanks to the panel, to Amy, Kim, Bernard, Jay, and also Tom and Ray as well. And thanks to the audience for sending in your great questions. I'd also like to let you know that there will be a very quick evaluation regarding your experience with this webinar. It should take less than 2 minutes to fill it out. So we do encourage you to do so that we can continue to improve our webinar program. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.